Welcome to Mystifying Miracles, everyone. Today, the story involves a mother and son who were traveling in Bolivia, and the military boards their bus, and it gets kind of dicey. But the question is, did God allow them to be invisible? I'm going to get into all the details. Stay tuned. Peggy Cunningham and her 15-year-old son Chuck were riding an old rickety bus, and Peggy was peering out the side, all at God's creation, and she was in awe of it. It was just beautiful. The bus had climbed to about 14,000 feet above sea level, and their bus had been traveling on an old dirt road in the Andes Mountains of Bolivia. And it was at this time that Peggy began to fear for their lives. As the bus was driving, Peggy's looking out, and she's noticing these 1,000-foot or more drop-offs. And the bus was going around these curves quite fast. They had been traveling on the Pan American Highway, and it had no guardrails, so it looked like you could just topple over at any second. Well, there came a point where the bus just abruptly stops once it reaches a mountain village. And Peggy's looking out, and she notices the Quechua Indians. They were dressed in their Indian garb, and they happened to be selling bread and fruit. Now, Peggy remembers just smelling in that good, crisp mountain air in this moment, and she loved it because 2 weeks prior, they had been living in a very humid climate, so it was just nice. But it wasn't soon after that point where Peggy begins to gasp for air, and she remembers this for a specific reason. So, the air's thinner in the mountains, and the dust on the dirt road, it kind of just choked her up a bit. And it was right then, at that moment, she notices uniformed military men. They began to surround their bus, and they were carrying machine guns. Now, a little bit about the previous 2 weeks leading up to this point. Her 15-year-old son, Chuck, had gotten typhoid fever, and he obtained it at the mission school where they lived and worked. Now, Chuck at the time had been at risk of dying, and the timing was terrible because also at this same time, there were just torrential flooding rains falling. Due to that, they couldn't make it 8 hours away to the nearest hospital. A lot of the roads, they had been washed away in the floods. And in addition, because of the rains, the planes weren't able to land, so there wasn't anybody able to come in those first few days to their rescue. But it was a few days after that they were finally able to radio for help, and a small plane was able to come in, land, and take them out. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital trying to recoup and recover, and they were now to the current point where they're on this old rickety bus heading back to the mission school. Now, because he's fresh off of having typhoid fever, Chuck was not energetic. He was still fatigued and recovering and recouping from all that. So he was kind of out of it during this moment. In addition, in the previous weeks, he had lost up to 30 pounds. So you can imagine. It was just like one bad thing after another, right? And now they find themselves on this old rickety bus that Peggy described as looking 100 years old. And it didn't help that the driver seemed to be in a race with everyone else on the road. So he's flying around these dangerous curves, and it just was a bit sketchy. The military that was surrounding them was now boarding the bus, and the reason being they were searching for drugs. But in addition to that, they were giving pat-downs to everyone, and they were searching for everyone's IDs. Peggy and her family had only been in Bolivia about a year, so they were still kind of getting used to everything. Everything was a little bit odd and strange still. So they hadn't been there too long. Peggy's husband and daughter were back at the mission school waiting for them to return on the bus. As the military is searching people and for their IDs, Chuck, the 15-year-old, seemed quite relaxed. He didn't know that Peggy and himself, they did not have their IDs with them. Now, the reason being, both of their passports were in La Paz, and they were being processed for permanent visas. Therefore, they didn't have them in this moment. And it was normal for people with no ID to be arrested and imprisoned, especially for foreigners. So as you can imagine, so many things are flying through Peggy's mind, and she's quite scared. She looks at her son and she tells Chuck, she says, "Put your head down, close your eyes, and pretend you are sleeping. We are going to pray that they don't see us." Chuck looked back at his mom and he gave her just this look of, "Are you mad, lady?" So he was like shocked. But his mother assured him that, "Don't worry, God's going to take care of us." So Peggy began to pray. And when she's praying, she knows that she's asking God for the impossible. One by one, each rider was checked by the military. Luggage was rummaged through. The pat-downs began. Every inch of that old rickety bus was being searched. Peggy and Chuck continued to look down, praying together. And then they could hear the military men's voices, and it was very intimidating because they spoke with authority. They had now gotten to where Peggy and Chuck were sitting, and the two of them could hear the compartment above their heads being searched. Peggy's heart was racing in this moment. She barely had the courage to open her eyes, and that's when she saw it. The men were moving right past their seats. In addition, one of the soldiers, as he was passing, the butt of his gun accidentally bumped Peggy's head. Peggy kind of opened her eyes more and she thought, did he not even feel that? Because he bumped her pretty hard. She thought, how odd. It was as if the way she described it, as if her and Chuck were frozen in time. It had now seemed like hours had passed since the beginning of the search on the bus. And now the military, they were leaving. They were all exiting and going. That's when Peggy was just flabbergasted. She says she was in awe. She couldn't even speak. The bus's engine started, and they were on their way again. That's when both Chuck and Peggy began thanking and praising the Lord for supernaturally protecting them. Peggy, in the book, she described it as if, she's like, me and my son, it was like we were invisible, as if we were two ghosts. They did not look at us, search us, nothing. I mean, think about that. Could that have been possible? They were made invisible. They knew in their hearts what had happened and that God had done something supernatural. They both know that had they been caught, they'd have gone to prison for sure. And because Chuck was still on the mend, he most likely wouldn't have survived. As the bus is pulling up to the mission school, the two of them could not wait. They were so excited to get off that bus, tell her husband and the daughter and everyone else there what had just occurred about that miraculous protection of Jesus. At the end of the story, I love how the book put it. It said, sleeping or awake, with or without machine guns passing by. Peggy, she for sure felt that peace in knowing that God alone kept both of them safe. Isn't that so cool? Like you don't, or at least I haven't come across too many stories like this where people supernaturally, as the story said, were invisible or people passed over them. I just find that fascinating and beautiful when God acts on our behalf, divine intervention, if you will, and it's so cool. I hope this story blessed you guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're having a fabulous week. Thank you so much for watching, and welcome to the new subscribers. I am so appreciative, and God bless. I'll see you next time.